You talking this dude that did some sick, twisted things to my little sis, okay? And you want to put me face to face with this dude.
In prison, one crime is universally despised. That's harming children. Once word gets out that an inmate is in for pedophilia, their fate is already sealed. These are 25 child molesters who were instantly killed in jail.
Prisoner dishing out his own brand of justice to a convicted offender.
Robert Munger. Shane Goldsby had made some poor choices in life, but nothing could have prepared him for what awaited him in prison. He was forced to share a cell with Robert Munger, a 70-year-old convicted for crimes against children, and he was yet to discover his sister was one of them. Robert, who had committed unspeakable crimes, didn't slow down on bragging about them. As Munger happily shared his twisted stories, Goldsby realized something horrifying. Furious and desperate, Goldsby begged the guards for a new cellmate, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. Trapped and filled with rage, Goldsby finally snapped. He waited for an opportunity for them to be in a common area, and then he unleashed his fury of 14 punches to Munger's face and head, followed by 4 brutal stomps, and then walked away. Munger didn't survive. Goldsby was sentenced to nearly 25 years for the murder, but who was to blame? David Bobb and Graham DeLuise Conti. Jonathan Watson, a California inmate serving time for murder, thought his transfer to a lower security dorm at Corcoran might be an improvement. But for Watson, it was anything but. He found himself sharing space with 2 child molesters. One was even a convicted child trafficker. Just 6 days after one of them was moved into the pod, Watson was already reaching his limit. He also begged the prison staff to move him back, warning that something bad would happen if they didn't just like Shane. But no one listened. The breaking point came when one of the men boldly decided to watch PBS Kids in front of everyone. Watson snapped. He packed his belongings, ready to leave, but was brushed off by the prison counselor. With no one taking him seriously, Watson decided to handle things his own way. Grabbing a cane from another inmate, he attacked. First, he targeted David, who seemed to be the mastermind of children crimes. And once he was done, he sought out Graham targeting children for sales, figuring he might as well finish what he started. When it was all over, Watson calmly walked up to a guard and confessed. At first, the officer didn't believe him until he saw the aftermath. David Bobb, who was 48, died on the spot, and Graham DeLuise Conti, who was 62, succumbed to his injuries 3 days later in the hospital. Watson later claimed he was simply delivering justice for the victims and their families. This particular prison justice was served ice cold, and Watson's story wouldn't be the only one. Andrew Thompson. Andrew Alexander Thompson, who was 35-year-old, was serving a 45-year sentence for 12 counts of using children to create explicit material. And even worse, his crimes involved animals. His victims included children as young as 2 years old. Inside Florida's Blackwater River Correctional Facility, Thompson crossed paths with 41-year-old Angel Velez, a man with his own violent history, locked up for armed robbery, aggravated battery, kidnapping, and a previous murder. On July 27, 2022, Velez decided to take matters into his own hands. Acting as judge, jury, and executioner, he used a torn bedclothing to strangle Thompson to death in his cell. No hesitation, no mercy. Afterward, Velez calmly walked up to a corrections officer and confessed to killing him with one less chomo to worry about. Velez is in Santa Rosa County Jail, held without bond for killing Andrew. Nelson Joseph Sanderson. 79-year-old Nelson Joseph Sanderson, serving 2 life sentences, learned the harsh reality that some crimes make you a target behind bars. Convicted of molesting his own granddaughters, Sanderson was already a pariah in society. But in prison, he was living on borrowed time. In 2016, after being convicted of his horrific crimes, Sanderson tried to flee the country, but law enforcement caught up with him. Fast forward to his time at Century Correctional Institution in Florida, and it didn't take long for someone to make him pay for his actions. He was found dead after being attacked by another inmate, Jeffrey Deuce. Jeffrey Deuce, a man who was already nabbed for crimes against children by going the length to also kidnap Leon Gary Plauch's son, Jody, was about to be escorted through an airport by police. But Plauch felt the justice system wasn't moving fast enough. On March 16, 1984, in front of cameras, Plauch took matters into his own hands. He pulled out a gun and shot Deuce, ending his life before he could ever make it to a jail cell. The shot was fatal, and Deutsch slipped into a coma, dying the following day. Plausch faced no prison time for his actions. Instead, he walked away with a 7-year suspended sentence, 5 years probation, and a few hundred hours of community service. One thing is certain, if Plausch hadn't acted, Deutsch would have likely faced the same fate at the hands of another inmate. There was no way such a despicable criminal was going to survive in prison. Ashley Brofo. On March 9, 2023, Ashley Brofo's life came to a brutal end, courtesy of 43-year-old Evan James Martin, who decided Brofo, a convicted child offender, didn't deserve to live another day. Martin entered Brofo's cell, locked him in a deadly chokehold, forcing him to the ground, and tightened his grip until Brofo lost consciousness. To make sure he finished the job, Martin stood on Brofo's throat, using his full body weight to suffocate him. Why the extreme measures? Brofo was a 40-year-old man with an intellectual disability who had lured a 9-year-old girl from a park near his home in Doubleview. Just days before his murder, Brofo had pleaded guilty to the charges against him. Yet, it wasn't the court that decided his fate. Evan Martin wasn't a stranger to violence. Already serving 11 years for attempting to kill another child sex offender in 20 using knife-like weapons crafted by another inmate, Martin showed no remorse for Brofo's death. In fact, he admitted to being guilty but was proud of what he'd done. For his actions, Martin was sentenced to life in prison with a non-parole period of 21 years. Mario Waters. Mario Waters, a 35-year-old man serving a life sentence, had only been at the Terre Haute facility since April 2023, following his March conviction for his role in a horrific scheme that exploited a 6-year-old girl. But in prison, fate, or perhaps prisoners serving life sentences, had other plans for him. He was involved in a case where a young girl was severely malhandled and even contracted STDs at the hands of Waters and another man, DeMarcus George. Waters admitted in court that he had a hand in targeting and taking advantage of this minor. The girl later revealed to federal investigators the details, how George and Waters took turns hurting her, sometimes even in the same hotel room. After a confrontation with another inmate at the U.S. Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, Waters was found dead. On January 15, 2024, he was pronounced dead later that day at a nearby hospital. The identity of the inmate responsible for his death remains undisclosed. Jason Turnbull. Jason Turnbull was serving a 10 to 15-year sentence at the Saginaw Correctional Facility in Freeland for third-degree sexual criminal conduct. On January 13, 2016, he was killed in his cell by Timothy Dickerson, a fellow inmate serving 6 or 15 years for armed robbery. Though Dickerson had a good chance of being released 6 months later, that opportunity vanished when he was found guilty of Turnbull's murder and sentenced to an additional 20 years. Prison officials reported that no weapons were found in the cell, and the motive for the altercation was unclear. However, it was suspected that Turnbull's criminal record may have played a role in the incident. Turnbull was found unresponsive in his cell, and despite efforts to resuscitate him, he was declared dead within an hour. The murder prompted a prison investigation, which revealed that the two inmates had a disagreement that escalated into a violent altercation. Dickerson did not contest the charges and was later transferred to the highest security level at Iona Correctional Facility, where the most dangerous inmates are housed. Richard Huckle. Richard Huckle, a 33-year-old from Ashford, Kent, committed some of the most horrifying crimes imaginable. He masterminded crimes against up to 200 children between 2006 and 2014. He was able to do this by posing as a devout Christian and a teacher whom people could trust with their kids. But behind that facade, he was a predator. He was given 22 life sentences in 2016 after admitting to 71 counts of abuse with victims as young as 6 months old. Investigators found over 20,000 indecent images and videos on his computer. He even tried to profit from his sickening acts, crowdfunding the release of his vile material on the dark web. In fact, he was compiling a twisted manual at the time of his arrest. But on October 13, 2019, Richard Huckle was found dead in his prison cell at Full Sutton Prison, East Yorkshire. The details of his murder are so extreme that they can't even be published in a video. Paul Fitzgerald had attacked him with a makeshift knife in what was described as a prolonged and horrific act of revenge. He was gagged, strangled, abused, beaten, and tortured in ways you can't even think of. To put it simply, it was horrific, brutal, and barbaric. The culprit, Fitzgerald, got a life sentence, without for parole for 34 years. James Palmucci. On the morning of October 26, 2020, in Charlotte County, Florida, jail staff discovered 48-year-old James Palmucci with fabric wrapped around his neck. They had been on their way to inform him about a scheduled court appearance because Palmucci was facing 83 charges related to crimes against children, including victims as young as 12. He allegedly used Snapchat to connect with his victims, and investigators found disturbing videos on his phone that showed him with one of them. But was it really suicide? The timing right before his court appearance raised questions. Did someone in the jail decide to take matters into their own hands? Most likely. John Geoghegan. John Joseph Jack Geoghegan, a once trusted Catholic priest, became one of the most notorious predators in the Archdiocese of Boston. Ordained in 1962, Geoghegan used his position to exploit over 150 boys, abusing his power and the trust of his parishioners. Despite numerous accusations and whispers about his behavior, the church consistently chose to move him to different parishes rather than address his crimes. Even after being removed from St. Julia's Parish in 1984 due to multiple complaints, Geoghegan was not truly punished. After undergoing treatment for pedophilia, he was allowed to return to his priestly duties, continuing his abuse as if nothing had changed. The truth finally emerged in 2002 when the Boston Globe Spotlight team uncovered the widespread sexual abuse by priests within the Archdiocese of Boston. The investigation revealed that the church had long covered up the crimes of numerous priests, including Geoghegan, in order to protect its reputation. That same year, Geoghegan was convicted for molesting a 10-year-old boy and was sentenced to prison. This marked a turning point in exposing the systemic abuse within the church. Joseph Druce, a convicted murderer who had suffered abuse as a child, learned of John Geoghegan's crimes and decided to take matters into his own hands. On August 23, 2003, after planning for a month, Druce carried out his revenge. He blocked the door to Geoghegan's cell, tied him up, gagged him, and then strangled him with a bedsheet. For this brutal act, Druce was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Geoghegan, at 68 years old, met a violent and much-deserved end. Christian Meyer. Christian Meyer, born on November 2, 1976, was a computer science graduate and a father of 2 children. Despite his family life, Meyer was one of the leaders of an online child exploitation ring that operated between 2012 and 2017. His criminal activities involved exploiting young girls by extorting inappropriate media from them. Meyer and his associates, which included about 9 other men, used various tactics, such as pretending to be teenage boys or blackmailing the victims, to coerce them into sending explicit material. This operation lasted for years, and by then, the men had successfully exploited 100 girls with inappropriate media until one of the victims collaborated with the FBI in 2017 to bring Meyer and his co-conspirators to justice. The next year, Christian Meyer was charged with sexual exploitation of a minor and other crimes, leading to his 40-year sentence in prison. When Adam Wright learned about it, he was also a convicted bank robber serving time. He took the lead in the attack alongside 2 other inmates, Alex Castro and Jason Cachego. Meyer was beaten mercilessly by Wright, while Castro and Cachego reportedly held him down, preventing any chance of escape. The injuries were too severe to survive. David Keever. It was just another routine check at 11:30 p.m. on June 30, 2019. Nothing out of the ordinary. But when the officers came back for the midnight check, they found Jimmy Ray Carruthers standing by the cell door. And when they shined a light inside, there it was Kever, lying lifeless on the floor. What really happened in that cell? Well, Kever had been in prison since 1994 for some seriously disturbing crimes on children less than 12, even assaulting a cop. And then he got rearrested in 2010 for not registering as a sex offender, which added nearly 9 more years to his sentence. In July 2019, while serving his time, Carruthers decided to take matters into his own hands by strangling his cellmate, Kever, stomping on his throat, leaving him dead on the cell floor. The autopsy showed Kever didn't stand a chance of manual strangulation. Head and neck injuries, fractures, bruises, the works. Carruthers was just a couple of years away from getting out in February 2021, but instead, he gave it all up just to keep kids safe from a predator. David Oseas Ramirez. David Oseas Ramirez, 56, was killed in Duval County Jail on July 30, 2019. by his cellmate, Paul Dixon. Dixon, who had been incarcerated since his teenage years, brutally attacked Ramirez during an argument, ultimately shoving his head into a toilet. The altercation escalated to the point of murder. Another inmate witnessed the crime but chose to remain silent, as cooperating with authorities, or snitching, in prison often results in severe consequences. Ramirez had been serving a life sentence for the abuse of an 11-year-old girl, which likely influenced the violent nature of his death. Clinton Don Simpson. Clinton Don Simpson, a preacher at Hazlitt Church of Christ, was accused in 2007 of molesting a 3-year-old girl while operating a miniature train in his backyard. The girl's parents came forward, and soon 12 other victims made similar allegations. Despite the severity of the accusations, justice was delayed for years. Simpson was placed under house arrest and later declared mentally unfit to stand trial, leading to his transfer to a state hospital in 2009. This excuse continued for years until a bench warrant was finally issued in 2018, bringing him back to Tarrant County Jail. While there, Simpson was attacked by 42-year-old David Faustino Flores, who struck Simpson repeatedly, slammed his head into the concrete, and continued the assault even when officers tried to intervene. Simpson died from severe head injuries shortly. At the time of his death, Simpson faced multiple charges, including 10 counts of aggravated sexual assault of a child, 3 counts of indecency by fondling, and 1 count. Cesar Pastrana. Cesar Pastrana was a respected member of his community, volunteering at his church and local school. However, his reputation took a severe hit after a weekend event at North Star Church in 2012. Accusations emerged, and a warrant was issued to reveal the dark truths of his actions. Pastrana had previously faced scrutiny after an incident at Barber Middle School, but was not fully exposed until the revelations about his crimes surfaced. In 2012, he was convicted of molesting 9 boys and sentenced to life in prison at Hancock State Prison. Unfortunately, he never served out his sentence. After a confrontation with another inmate, Pastrana was killed by noon that day, with no details needed to explain the reason for his death. Matteo Condalucci. Matteo Condalucci, a security officer by profession, had a horrifying history of child abuse. His first conviction was in 1994 for molesting a 5-year-old boy, for which he served just 5 years in prison. More than a decade later, in 2007, he was convicted again after assaulting a 13-year-old girl, but this crime resulted in only a 2-year sentence. These, shockingly, didn't end there, since he was even accused of molesting and domestically abusing his own daughter until she was a teenager. In short, Condalucci was a nightmare. He was a man whose actions haunted his victims and disgusted the community, but he didn't foresee the vengeance that would arrive at his doorstep. On May 14, 2020, James Fairbanks, a schoolteacher and father of 2, decided to confront him. Armed with a handgun, Fairbanks approached Condalucci's house after reportedly seeing him watching children play from his driveway. His intent was initially to intimidate, but when Condalucci answered the door and moved toward him, the confrontation escalated. Fairbanks pulled the trigger, firing 7 shots. The first struck Condalucci in the forehead, while subsequent bullets hit his back and chest. After the shooting, Fairbanks left the scene, but later pleaded no contest to second-degree murder. On July 14, 2021, he was sentenced to 40 to 70 years in prison, a decision that solidified his fate behind bars. Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein, probably the most well-known individual in this video, doesn't need an introduction. He was a convicted offender who allegedly ran a trafficking ring involving minors from 2002 to 2005. Until his arrest in 2019, he was apprehended on July 6, 2019, facing federal charges for operating this ring in Florida and New York. Epstein was accused of hiring young girls, some as young as 14, for exploitative purposes and using them to recruit other minors. He was facing a potential maximum sentence of 45 years if convicted, but on August 10, 2019, he was found dead in his jail cell. The official cause of death was ruled a suicide by hanging. However, this sparked widespread rumors and speculation. Was it really a suicide, or was there something more sinister at play? Did someone want to silence him before he could reveal details about his powerful connections? No one knows. DeAndre Austin. DeAndre Austin, once a criminal on the streets of Richmond, was convicted for the repeated abuse of his 3 young nieces. He was sentenced to life in prison on multiple counts of inappropriate conduct with minors under 14, aggravated assault, and forced acts of abuse. On October 14, 2020, at around 5:40 p.m., someone shouted, "Man down!" And when officers reached Austin's cell, they found him motionless, beyond help. Less than an hour later, he was declared dead. Cause of death? Homicide. All eyes were on his cellmate, Rodney Jordan. Word spread that Rodney couldn't tolerate living next to someone with such a criminal history. Theodore Dyer. Stephen Sanderson, a 51-year-old inmate already serving a life sentence for murder, found himself in a situation that pushed him over the edge. Sharing a cell with 67-year-old Dyer, a man convicted for deeply troubling offenses against children, was challenging enough. But Dyer's continuous attempts to justify his actions became unbearable for Sanderson. Dyer, a former resident of the Grand Haven area, was serving a 25 to 50-year sentence for a serious crime against a 9-year-old girl. The young girl, who lived nearby, would occasionally visit his home under the guise of trust. However, her visits masked a dark reality. One day, her mother arrived unexpectedly and walked in on a scene that left her horrified. Without hesitation, she contacted law enforcement to ensure that Dyer was held accountable for his actions. On that fateful day, the tension reached its boiling point. Sanderson delivered several blows to Dyer's face before grabbing a cord and wrapping it tightly around his cellmate's neck. It was a final act of rage and frustration that left Dyer lifeless in the cell. Liam Dean. Liam Dean, a 22-year-old father, was convicted of the tragic and brutal killing of his newborn daughter Luna, who was only 2 days old. While his partner, Karen Bissett, stepped away for a brief rest, Dean lost his temper. Unable to soothe Luna's cries, he acted in a fit of rage, inflicting devastating injuries by striking, gripping, and shaking the defenseless child. Later, he lied and claimed she had suffered a fall. However, during questioning, his horrifying reality came to light. Dean's sentencing was swift, but his time in prison was short-lived. Just 1 month into his term, on November 12, 2018, Dean was discovered lifeless in his cell. Investigators quickly turned their attention to his cellmate, John Westland, a man serving time for serious offenses, including assault and grievous bodily harm. While Westland denied any involvement, the evidence told a different story. Authorities determined that he had used the sharp edge of a broken aftershave bottle to take Dean's life. Westland reportedly admitted he could not abide sharing a cell with someone who had harmed an innocent child. Anthony Palma. Anthony Palma, a 59-year-old convicted murderer, met a violent end in his prison cell on January 11, 2019. Palma's sinister past had finally caught up to him. In 1997, 8-year-old Kirsten Hatfield mysteriously disappeared from her home, leaving behind little evidence, and for nearly 2 decades, her case baffled investigators and devastated her family. It wasn't until 2015, with advancements in DNA technology, that the truth was found. Blood found on Kirsten's bedroom windowsill and clothing discarded in her backyard were linked to Palma, who had lived just 2 doors away at the time of her disappearance. This critical evidence led to his conviction and a life sentence for his heinous actions. However, life in prison was far from a safe haven for Palma. On that fateful January day, his cellmate, Raymond Palladdo, a man with a history of violence, already serving time for a string of violent crimes, including shooting with intent to kill and 3 counts of first-degree murder, reportedly strangled Palma with an extension cord in an attack described as both deliberate and merciless. Clinton Don Simpson. Clinton Don Simpson was once a North Texan respected preacher and the operator of a popular children's tourist attraction. Parents in the community saw him as a kind and trustworthy figure, someone who provided a safe and enjoyable space for their children. Little did they know, Simpson had a dark side that would eventually shatter this illusion. When a young girl reported an unsettling encounter with Simpson to her parents, an investigation was done, and soon other children came forward with similar stories, revealing a pattern of inappropriate behavior. The charges against him were serious. Multiple counts of harming children, including accusations of continuous mistreatment and indecent actions. Initially placed under house arrest in 2007, Simpson's legal proceedings faced significant delays due to his deteriorating mental health. For nearly a decade, he remained in state hospitals, deemed unfit to stand trial. In 2010, Simpson was transferred back to Tarantino County Jail for further evaluations and to finally face the justice system. However, he never made it to trial. His cellmate, 42-year-old David Faustino Flores, took matters into his own hands. Flores, already serving time for serious crimes, reportedly attacked Simpson, striking him repeatedly in the head. Simpson was rushed to John Peter Smith Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma. While a lot of people felt robbed of the chance for a proper trial and accountability, others saw it as a resolution to a disturbing chapter. Juan Villanueva. In October 2022, Juan Villanueva was sentenced to life in prison for crimes involving the mistreatment of a child under 14. However, his time behind bars came to a sudden and violent end. How? On a Friday morning in February 2023, Villanueva was found unresponsive in his cell at North Kern State Prison. He had been attacked and killed by his cellmate, Ramon Escobar, a man with a serious and frightening criminal history. Escobar was already serving a life sentence without parole for a series of brutal murders in 2018. His rampage, which spanned a month, left 5 people dead, including his aunt and uncle. After fleeing Texas, Escobar had taken to the streets of Los Angeles and Santa Monica, where he targeted vulnerable individuals while posing as a homeless man. He was notorious for bludgeoning his victims with heavy objects, often while they were sleeping. Villanueva's body was discovered during a routine check by prison officials. Despite their immediate attempts to resuscitate him and a quick call for medical assistance, he was pronounced dead at the scene. The exact method Escobar used to end Villanueva's life remains unclear, but investigators suspect it was in line with his known violent tendencies. Both men were at the reception center awaiting placement within the state prison system when the attack occurred. Following the incident, Escobar was transferred to restricted housing, and authorities launched a thorough investigation. Nicholas Anderson. Nicholas Anderson became the 3rd victim of Rocky Ali Beeman's ruthless mission to target certain inmates in prison. On January 22, 2017, Anderson, who was serving time as a convicted offender, was discovered lifeless in his cell. Authorities found him bound, strangled, and fatally wounded with an improvised weapon. Beeman had gained infamy for his public declarations against individuals with child molestation convictions. He openly expressed his hatred and vowed to continue his attacks until he was placed on death row. In May 2018, Beeman penned a frightening letter to Christopher Patterson, a judge in the 14th District Judicial Circuit. In the letter, he described the killings as giving him a sense of purpose and stated he would keep eliminating targets until one of 3 things happened. He was killed, he ran out of targets, or he was placed on death row where he could no longer act on his violent impulses. Adding to the gravity of his threats, Beeman declared that he would dedicate his next murder to the judge unless his demands were met. This weren't idle talks. Beeman's history included another gruesome act in 2012 when he killed Brian Hunziker, another inmate with a similar conviction. Beeman reportedly stalked Hunziker within the prison walls for days, eventually cornering him in the showers where he carried out the attack. Hunziker was stabbed up to 80 times in a brutal and premeditated assault. Before these murders, Beeman was already serving a life sentence for the killing of a woman. His violent streak, which began long before his incarceration, eventually led to him being sentenced to death. The thin line between punishment and vengeance for molesters is quite blurry, and it leaves us to question where justice truly ends.